Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to Quadriga, coming to you from the heart of Berlin. Now, Germany's two biggest political parties are currently trying to forge a new coalition government. The problem is, though, that Angela Merkel's Conservatives and the Social Democrats both suffered historic losses in last September's election, and it's the same picture in much of the rest of Europe, where traditional, broad-based parties are increasingly coming under pressure from brash and often aggressive populist parties who win voters over by offering simple solutions to complex problems. So, how should the mainstream parties respond, and can they survive? So our question on Quadriga this week: Europe's far right, can the established parties stop them? And to discuss that question, I'm joined here in the studio by Matthew Karnitschnig, Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico. He says Europe's populists are here to stay. If traditional mainstream parties fail to reinvent themselves soon, it's only a matter of time before the fringe supplants them. Also with us is Alan Posener, columnist with the Berlin daily Die Welt, who argues that political parties alone can't stop the rise of the far right. Civil society, from trade unions to soccer clubs, needs to rally around liberal democracy. And a very warm welcome, too, to Géraldine Schwarz. She's a French-German journalist who's just published a book about the role of her family under the Nazis. And Géraldine says the emergence of Europe's far-right populists is linked to the way in which individual European countries have, since the Second World War, tried or not tried to come to terms with their history. All very interesting stuff. I'm going to begin with you, Alan Posener. And it was just a couple of days ago that the far-right Alternative for Germany party here in Germany, for a moment at least, actually overtook in the opinion polls one of the mainstream parties here, the broad-based parties, the Social Democrats. I know that that was really just a snapshot, but it was an interesting moment, and I wondered what your thoughts are about that moment.
Well, it's sad for, the Social Democratic Party, which is the oldest party in Germany, the only party in Germany which can trace its history back to before the Second World War, the party that stood up to Hitler in the Reichstag and said no when Hitler gave himself dictatorial powers and so on. The party of Willy Brandt and what have you. Schmidt. And Helmut Schmidt, well, that's not one of... I'm not a fan of Helmut Schmidt's, but yes, so it's really sad. It's not... The sad thing isn't that the AfD, the far-right AfD, gets run up 15%, 16% in polls. The sad thing is that a party which represents sort of the broad working class in the broader sense, or should represent them, is down to that segment. So, yeah, it's sad, but as Matthew said in his statement, they have to reinvent themselves. I mean, we've discussed this a lot of times. If I knew how, I'd probably be the leader of the Social Democrats, not just a journalist. Well,
let's let Matthew answer that in just a second. But, Matthew, I mean, the Alternative for Germany now is looking set to become the main opposition party here in Germany. They're certainly in the Bundestag, we know that. Time magazine wrote in its most recent edition, the established parties, meanwhile, are in free fall. Why are they in free fall?
I think one of the reasons, especially with the Social Democrats, is that they are, to a degree, victims of their own success. And when you look back and, as a sort of nostalgic lens, as Alan has done, and talked about the pre-war period and so forth in the 19th century when these parties started, they were pushing for things like universal health care, pensions, retirement pensions, and these kinds of things, all of which have been realized. So they're not really the party of the working class anymore that they once were, because they've helped lift people out of the working class into the middle class with things like free university education, free education writ large. So I think that, they've had difficulty, not just recently, but really since the Berlin Wall fell down, to adapt to this new world which has become more globalized, more liberalized, and so forth.
But you said at the beginning that the Social Democrats, nevertheless, despite everything you just said, need to reinvent themselves. The Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's Conservatives, need to reinvent themselves too. How, against the backdrop of what you've just been telling us?
Well, I would argue that maybe the Christian Democrats don't need to reinvent themselves. I think that we might be moving to a situation, and in Germany and maybe some other European countries, where you're going to have one centrist party. and that the Social Democrats will become just another niche party, because they've also, over the years, they've spawned other smaller parties like the Greens, for example, the Linke, obviously, when they had the split in Germany in the early 2000s. So I don't know that the center-right is going to need to reinvent itself. I think the bigger problem is what happens on the left, or the bigger question is, are you going to have sort of a union of these leftist parties in Germany and some other countries? Because for now, the center-right seems to be sitting pretty. They did lose a bit in the last election, but they're still over 30%, and there's no reason to think that they can't sort of regroup with the right leadership, because their message really does speak more to these middle classes, and they have shown also organizationally that they can maintain power and govern in a very effective way.
Let's bring Géraldine in. Géraldine, you've been, as I mentioned earlier, you've been writing a book about the role of your family under the Nazis, and this, at the same time as we're seeing the rise of populist far-right parties across Europe in many different countries. That's a difficult mixture. What are your feelings given that?
Well, I mean, my concern is more the rising distrust towards democracies, because nothing new has been invented in the last 70 years after the war. So the result of it is that the distrust of democracy leads to a kind of nostalgia feeling towards what was before the democracy of post-World War II. And this is fascism and and National Socialism. My feeling, of course, as a French and German person, is that the world where I've been brought up, the freedom, democracy, Europe has been in freedom for 70 years, and this is something people are forgetting. This is something that was allowed by also the way Europe dealt with its past after World War II. And now my feeling is that this consensus towards history is breaking, you know?
Let me just pick up on that word. You just mentioned the word forgetting. Your book is actually called Les Amnésiques in French. In English, I suppose that would be the amnesiacs, or people who have lost their memory. Tell us just a little bit more about that and why it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Well, because I think that the way people dealt with their history, for example, Germany, allowed Germany to build up its democracy. The democracy of Germany, you can't separate it from the way Germany dealt with its past. So when you have a party like the AfD, which is attacking this way of dealing with memory that is fundamentally for the democracy, then in a way this party attacks also the democracy. Because the way of dealing with history in Germany especially brought the people, the civilians, to develop a sense for individual moral responsibility.
Do you want to pick up on that, Alan?
No, well, I'm not really, because I agree totally. I mean, I can't say much about that. You're totally right, Geraldine.
OK, let's go back to the alternative for Germany. As we've seen, they are now a far-right party. They're in the German parliament, the Bundestag. The question is now how to respond to them and their presence. Here is one example.
In September 2017, the far-right populist Alternative for Germany became the third largest party in Germany's Bundestag. They claim to be the only ones who can preserve Germany. The rhetoric is getting tougher on all sides.
No, I won't allow any heckling. All the members sitting there from the AfD, if they were honest, they'd admit that they disdain this country and everything for which it is highly regarded the world over and respected. A part of this is our owning up to our past, which as a citizen of this country I am proud of. And I want to shout out to you that our Germany, this Germany, is stronger than your hatred ever will be.
The speech by Greens representative Cem Özdemir to the Bundestag swiftly went viral on social media. Is the force of political convictions enough to stop the right-wingers?
Cem Özdemir with passion and conviction, Alan. Is that the right way to stand up to the AfD in the German parliament?
Definitely, and I'm very grateful quite personally, because this was a debate about a colleague of mine a German-Turkish colleague called Deniz Yücel, who was imprisoned for a year without charges in a Turkish jail and was released. And it was the AfD who demanded a debate in the German Bundestag and demanded of the government that they distance themselves from some critical remarks Yücel had made about the German government. And it was in this debate, and the attempt was simply to set up the Bundestag as the German parliament as a censor agency for journalism. And in this debate, I think Cem Özdemir, who, like Deniz Yücel, is a of German-Turkish origin, showed them where they get off, and in no uncertain terms. And I think it was very good that we had a member of the Green Party, which sort of traditionally have been wary of German patriotism, generally speaking, really using patriotic language to show that, in fact, the AfD, the right-wingers, actually do hate everything that post-war Germany stands for, as indeed does the Front National in France, as indeed do the right-wingers in Poland. They hate this new Germany, this new Europe. And I thought that, you know, I'm not generally speaking here someone who tends to represent green opinions, but I thought that Cem Özdemir he was the only one in that debate who really had the fire to combat the AfD.
Is the danger not that if you start getting fiery and combative in that way, that it becomes a shouting match in the German parliament? Matthew?
Well, I think that's obviously a danger, and I think Germany, given the Weimar history and so forth, might be particularly sensitive to that. Although I found it refreshing that for once there was real debate going on, there was a real exchange of ideas and viewpoints. I do think, and I thought that the speech was very important because it sent a very clear message. I would add, though, that I think that Özdemir was really preaching to the choir in a way. I don't know that he convinced many AfD voters of his side. I thought it was important because he, as Alan said, sort of redefined German patriotism in his own terms and said, this is what it means to be German, not what you think it means to be German. But I think that the larger problem here is that the AfD, continues to get 15, 16% in the polls, and the same as in other countries. And it's because of this issue of migration, of refugees, that the established parties, going back to what we were talking about before, why the SPD can't really reinvent itself at the moment. I think that this issue of migration is at the core of it because they have traditionally been an internationalist party. They're very open to asylum, to taking in refugees of all kinds, and they wouldn't have any credibility were they to reverse their position on that. And this is where I think the center-right has had a bit of an advantage, particularly if you look at Austria now under Sebastian Kurz, who's obviously been very out front in strengthening the asylum rules there. But even in Germany, Merkel has this reputation as being the mother of all refugees, but in fact, if you look at what the CDU has done over the past couple of years in tightening asylum rules, it's been quite extraordinary. So I think this is sort of a fundamental issue that is bubbling beneath the surface still, that is the biggest challenge that the left-leaning parties have.
And Géraldine?
Just to come back to Özdemir's speech, I think, of course, he doesn't convince the hardcore voters of AfD, but maybe he convinced the other ones. He convinced the Social Democrats who are now voting AfD, because people need also emotion. And I think someone like Özdemir and this kind of debate fuels a bit the debate with emotions. And this is very important nowadays, because nowadays only the populist parties are giving this emotion. So we need more emotions from the part of the other parties. But I didn't find this debate very interesting, because I found it actually very depressing that in Germany today we have in 2018 a debate on freedom of speech and of press. This is we are going back.
Well, talking about going back, people are suddenly talking a lot about pride. People are talking about identity. People talk about nation states rather than social groupings. There's even been a call for a conservative revolution. Where's all that coming from suddenly?
I'm not totally against a sense of pride. You can be proud of your country. I think Germany, maybe this was a bit too long a taboo, that you are not allowed to be proud of this of the country, and so I think it's this is not linked for me to nostalgia of the past. Mm-hmm. But we have to build it on a very clear basis, which is the basis of being proud of the German constitution, the German democracy, what Germany has done since 45, you know, and not against immigration or against the other based nationalism.
Mm. Alan, are far-right populist parties now part of the mainstream across Europe?
Well, as you said, they've actually managed to redefine the debate. Even someone like Cem Özdemir, when he comes on the Bundestag, he talks, he uses the language, the form of language, patriotism, love of country, which, let's face it, let's hand it to them, the right-wing populists introduced into the debate. And the problem here is that this is part of a worldwide trend. We've got Russia basically playing 19th century great power politics. We've got President Trump saying America first, which basically means you know, that none of the rules binding international organizations and countries together, they're simply deals for him, bad or good deals. We've got Brexit, we've got Britain's people saying we want to take control of our country again, as if that were possible in the 21st century. And now we've got within Europe, the Visegrad groups, Eastern Europe countries, Hungary, saying they don't want closer integration, they want less integration. And then we've got the populists here. So it's obvious that we're entering...
the return of Silvio Berlusconi this weekend.
Yeah, so we're entering, you know, we're being dragged kicking and screaming, us people who believe in the liberal world order, into a much less liberal world disorder. And it's frightening, quite frankly.
OK, so could this be the beginning of a populist era? That's one question. Another is, could it be the era of charismatic politicians, leaders not of parties but of popular movements, people like Emmanuel Macron in France, and we've mentioned him already, Sebastian Kurz in Austria?
High expectations were riding on Emmanuel Macron when he took the French presidency and the European stage. He'd founded the En Marche party especially for the election, swiftly gathering hundreds of thousands of supporters and millions of voters with his power of persuasion and pro-European direction. It was enough to win against Marine Le Pen and her right-wing populist Front National.
Vive la République! Vive la France!
Sebastian Kurz, too, is a party platform on two legs. The conservative Austrian People's Party made the charismatic politician their chairman. He set out on the campaign trail with his Kurz ticket. It was open to non-party members as well. He left behind the right-wing populist FPO, but then included them in his coalition. Do Macron and Kurz embody a new political culture for Europe?
That's the question, Matthew. Emmanuel Macron, Sebastian Kurz, do they represent the new European politics?
I think they do in some countries, and we've seen that in other places as well. I don't think Kurz's strategy is that different from, say, Viktor Orban's in Hungary. That said, you know, Kurz is obviously much younger. He's a fresh face. The interesting thing about Kurz is that he did this within an established party. The ÖVP, the Austrian People's Party, has been in power, often as a junior partner, but has been in the government coalition in Austria since 1987. So it's really an extraordinary thing when you talk about this backlash against the establishment, that there's somebody, you know, he's about 30 years old, comes in, sort of changes the name of the party, calls it the Sebastian Kurz list and so forth, and manages to pull this off. And how did he pull it off? It was because he used the same tools that the populists use. He used the same sort of media tools that they've used. And he also stole their main theme, which is, again, migration, fear of refugees.
But is that then one strategy against the far right that could be adopted by other parties across Europe, perhaps even by Germany's
But then they become like the far right, which is what they say that they don't want to do. And this is where this question of credibility comes in. That's why I think it's difficult for the center-left parties to copy that strategy, because they don't have the same credibility. If say, the SPD were to come out and say, well, we want to enact really strict rules on asylum and immigration, they wouldn't have the credibility because for the past 70 years, they've been preaching something else. And I think you've seen that, for example, in Italy, where there is this election this weekend. Matteo Renzi was also sort of hailed as this Macron-like figure, very popular young guy, was going to reform everything and make everything better. And they're probably going to get around 20% on Sunday. So it's not just the personality. There are other factors there that really are important.
Is it possible that in German politics there could be somebody like Jens Spahn, the angry young man of conservative politics, could look to how Sebastian Kurz has been doing things and think that's one way to go? Or is that inconceivable in German politics?
No. I mean, as Matthew said, I think the Christian Democrats, Angela Merkel's strategy was to move the Christian Democrats to the left, because when she started in that strategy, they were worried that the Christian Democrats would be marginalised and the Social Democrats would take the centre. She managed that, opened up a position on the right, and Jens Spahn, for instance, would move the Christian Democrats back to the right, trying to squeeze out the AfD. He might manage, though he himself, I think, is a bit of a lightweight person, you know, sort of a Twitter personality rather than... Well, but anyway, yeah, that's the way it could go. But it can go in different directions. Look at Great Britain. Look at Jeremy Corbyn with a left-wing populist message challenging Theresa May. And look at... what might be happening in the United States. Look where the Democrats are now, advocating universal health care and things which, you know, a decade ago in America would have been rabid socialism. So, you know, it's on both sides of the political divide that people are ramping up the populist message.
And Géraldine, where does Emmanuel Macron fit into all this? Left, right, the battle against right-wing populism. What can we learn from him?
Well, I mean, actually, he's the big winner also because of the electoral system in France, which allows it. In Germany, it would not be possible because of the electoral system. This is the first point. And the second is also he's ruling in a quite authoritarian way in France. And I'm not sure in Germany the government or a team would allow this kind of authoritarian rule. But it is true that now the Front National is totally down, and I think it's at its lowest in the 10 last years. And but it doesn't mean it's forever down, you know. So if he fails, if Macron fails, then the first party of France will be the Front National.
I think that's an important point, that these parties, they sometimes go down in the polls, and then, you know, the sort of commentariat, people like us say, oh, well, that's the end of populism. If you watch it over the past few decades, that certainly hasn't been the case. They're sort of dormant for a while. It's sort of like cancer that goes into remission and then comes back when there's a problem. And you saw this in Germany with the AfD as well, which, when they were having their internal struggles a few years ago, fell into the low single digits. And as soon as the refugee crisis came, I think by the end of that year, they were around 10%, and they obviously finished at 12% in the last poll. So I think the problem with these parties is that once they take hold in the system, as the AfD has done now in the Bundestag, it's very difficult to get rid of them.
And if this is one great big battle, Alan, between the established mainstream parties, the broad-based parties that have been part of the post-war settlement right across Europe, a battle between them and between the new, young populist parties, who's going to win?
Well, I say it's more than that. It's a battle between the liberal world order and the illiberal world disorder. And I think it's in the back. And let's not forget, behind the illiberal order, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got great powers, you've got Islamism, and you've got the populist things. It's in the balance. It's a fight. It's not, it's not easy.
Why are so many people tempted by the illiberal order and tempted to shift away from democracy?
Because they've forgotten how it looks like when there is no democracy, because they haven't lived it, you know? Because the war is 70 years ago. So, we have to remind people again and again. I think so.
No, I agree. I mean, I think this idea about the nostalgia of the past, people tend to sort of mythologize the past, especially a past that they didn't experience, which is why I think this book is sort of interesting, because people collectively forget how it really was. But at the same time, it does appear that there is a large swathe of the population in Europe and in the West, in the US as well, that is just not happy culturally with the way things have moved over the past 30 years or so, with globalization, with increased immigration in all of these countries, and that's not going to change.
OK, and the best way to combat the far right, in one sentence, in a nutshell?
Is to do, I think, what Özdemir has done, which is to confront them head on and to not hide from the debate, to take them head on with real arguments.
Alan, your formula?
Yeah, make democracy sexy again.
Make democracy sexy, yeah. Geraldine?
Yes, I totally agree. and remind also that democracy is also work for citizens. Citizens have to participate much more in political life. OK, thank you for all that, all three of you. Thank you for being here today. We've been talking about Europe's far right. Can the established parties stop them? Thanks for joining us. Come back next week. Bye-bye and cheers.